Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. I'm here today, as usual, with clinical psychologist Dr. Rick Hanson. So, Dad, how are you doing?
Doing great and looking forward to this.
Yeah, same. Today we're opening up the mailbag and we're going to be answering some questions from our listeners. We love the mailbag episodes. We've gotten a really positive response to them recently. If you'd like to have a question answered on a future episode of the podcast, the best way is by signing up for our Patreon. You can find us at patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And you can also send an email to contact@beingwellpodcast.com. Also, I want to give you a quick reminder about an offering from Rick. It says Self-Worth Workshop. It's an online course starting October 4th that includes 6 hours of recorded teaching with Rick, and it'll help you develop a stronger sense, hopefully, of worth and belonging. So therapists and mental health professionals can also earn 4 continuing education credits. It's really cool that Rick offers those through his courses, and you can learn more at rickhanson.com/worthy. and use coupon code BEINGWELL25 to receive a 25% discount. So we're going to start today with a bit of a longer question, but I think that the context is important here. And as we were getting ready to record this, Rick and I were talking a little bit, and there's kind of a theme throughout this episode of a lot of questions where you could really see the answer kind of going either way or without a really decisive answer, but it's kind of about having good process throughout. So here we go with the first question. I'm struggling with whether to give my ex another chance. We're in our early 30s, and we were together for 4.5 years before breaking up about 10 months ago because of classic anxious avoidant attachment issues. I was pushing for more commitment while he was pulling away. After months of no contact, he reached out. We've both been doing a lot of work on ourselves, including getting more clear about our tendencies, and we've both acknowledged the past issues that led to the breakup. Our communication is much clearer now, and the feelings are definitely still there. Part of me wonders if we could make it work now with our new awareness and skills, but I'm cautious. I doubt those issues around long-term commitment have changed overnight, and wonder if this is just a way for me to avoid the pain of the breakup. Maybe I'm just struggling to accept that it's over. So my question: is it ever worth trying to revisit an old relationship with fresh eyes after you've both grown, or do the old dynamics inevitably resurface? Should I trust the feeling that things could go better, or am I just fooling myself? Okay, a lot there, Dad. What do you think?
Well, I know that you, in your usual way, have developed and gone into the research literature.
Thought about this
Literally,
a little
there
bit.
is
Yeah,
a
totally.
research literature about, when to hold them and when to fold them.
As it turns out, I didn't realize there was until I searched for this particular question. But it turns out people have done research on it. I forget what the exact term was, but it's like renewal in relationships. So on again, off again relationships.
Oh, yeah. Well, if anybody can find, the proverbial needle in the haystack out there, it will be you.
I'm a professional of Google Scholar. Absolutely.
That's it. So I thought about this, and so I'm going to say some blunt things that you will soften the edges of astutely, I'm sure. Okay. So here we have someone, as I understand it, early 30s. The developmental clock is ticking. 4.5 years already. One person wanting more commitment. That's the person who asked the question. The other person, I think referred to as he, has, been more distancing. All right. So now what do you do? Some key questions. First question is, are you driving your partner crazy by excessive, inappropriate clinging and needs for reassurance that understandably would tend to push somebody away, particularly if they're more avoidant in their nature, on the one hand. On the other hand, if really, your natural temperature setting wants, more closeness in reasonable ways, and maybe you're a little twitchy about asking for it, because when you get triggered, you're a little that way, but you repair that and you acknowledge it. It's all normal range. But this person still is just interested in a temperature setting in relationships that's really cooler than what you actually want for your mate in this life, or is someone who is just going to be ambivalent, one leg in, but one leg out. That's their way. They're probably never going to change that unless they're really seriously committed to changing it, which goes to my other side of the question from my experience with people, that essentially you're assessing the other person's growth curve. You're assessing their rate of change. Probabilistically, you're trying to estimate it. And is their rate of growth rapid enough, frankly, to be a good fit for you? It's easy to get into judgmentalism and, I'm trying to stay out of that. People are different and they want different things. But fundamentally, if you're trying to assess if this person is going to be with you in ways that are going to make you happy for the rest of your life, to wake up next to them or something in that direction, you have to assess their rate of change in the direction that you're interested in. And if your assessment is that this person is kind of settled into their way of being, maybe they say the good things, but deep down they're not really budging in far-reaching ways, then often it's really quite poignant but necessary to let yourself become disenchanted and to realize that, well, either, okay, I'll settle for a relationship that's giving me, kind of tepid levels of engagement. And for various reasons, I'm going to stick around. Or you might make a fateful choice that says, no, so sorry. It's been a good ride, but I'm going to clear the space now for a different kind of a person to come in.
Great. I think that's a great overview for starters, Dad, on just some like good advice here. Based on the little bit of research that I bumped into, and this was research that I think was done in 2009, and it was on again, off again dating relationships. I forget the name of the study authors, so apologies for that. But you can probably Google it and find this if you're interested in looking for it. And the general broad finding, as you would probably expect, is that relationships that go through that on, off, on are generally not as fulfilling for people as ones that are just on and kind of stick there.
Yeah.
Now, is this because they go through endless on, off cycles, or is this because they kind of stick, but they never quite get the person's needs met because there was some meaningful reason that they broke up in the first place? I don't know. I think that's a bit of an open question. But it just stands out to me that if you're going to do this with somebody, you don't want to enter the on again, off again forever death spiral. That's what you really want to avoid. So if you're getting on the train here, it's really because you think you're getting on the train pretty permanently, or at least for the foreseeable future. And I think that the big questions about this are actually not about insight. And that's, again, maybe a theme throughout this episode that we'll return to. There's a lot of insight in this question. They're saying, here are my patterns, here are my partner's patterns, and we've both become increasingly aware of those patterns, and we're really investigating them. We're thinking about them. We're doing the work, as they say, right? My big question is, are you doing the work in a way that leads to actual behavioral change in the relationship, distinct from insight? So you can be insightful about a lot of stuff, but if it doesn't actually lead to your behavior being different, the insight's got a real timer on it in terms of its utility in the relationship. I don't know if that's something that you've actually seen in relationships, Dad, in terms of the people who walked into your office when you were working with couples.
I think your use of the term timer is right. And it's natural and it's okay to name it. People have a timer and sometimes they'll pick marker events like, it's got to really feel different by Christmas, let's say, in a few months, let's say. And that's true. I'm a little biased, and I'm sure my bias comes a little bit from my own privileges of various kinds. I'm a big advocate, it's my bias, toward possibility. And for people exercising a lot of self-reliance on their own behalf toward what they really want in this life, and being attentive to the ways that good can crowd out great. And I don't mean I'm not trying to support unrealistic fantasies about soulmate wonderfulness and everything's perfect, the fairy prince, the fairy princess. No, but our primary relationship really matters, and especially if you're not tangled with them in owning property and or raising children together, right? I kind of. I see the magnificence in each person, and I think you deserve another magnificent type person who is magnificent for you. I'm biased.
Yeah. I think the big question here is like, do you feel like you're really going to get your needs met by this person? And sure, you can try it on again. And if you decide though that you're not going to get your needs met by this person in a kind of durable way, then I would have a pretty short leash on how long the on again is going to last for before you really wash your hands of the whole thing. That I think is kind of my summary take here.
Yeah, it's interesting now. What do we mean by needs and how do we prioritize our needs?
Hmm.
You know, and also how do we see our life? It's interesting that most people, sorry, Forrest, but most people were dead in hunter-gatherer times before they were your age.
Oh, this is so
Definitely.
real. This is so real. Yeah, no, I think that like honestly, this is one of those things that's really messed with our heads in terms of our perception of
Yeah.
time in modern life and
Yeah.
all of that. So keep on going. I think it's a great point.
Yeah. So I think there are, it's reasonable to go for, as I stated it, your mate in this life. There's a lot to be said for finding someone great and continuing to repair the relationship. I got lucky with your mom, etc. Yeah, go for it. On the other hand, sometimes maybe a realistic notion is serial monogamy, in relationships that are 1 or 2 decades long. And
Hmm.
that's sort of how you're imagining playing out this life. So therefore, when you think about your needs met, you might think to yourself, well, I like this person a lot. There's definitely something kind of missing. Maybe we don't connect intellectually or erotically or interest in the opera or something. But I'm going to, hopefully it'll be good. And, it may be that 20 years from now, I'm going to take a breath and you know, part company. That's in my planning structure. If you think about different durations naturally
Yeah,
of
to maybe put a
relationships.
different twist on what you're saying here, Dad. I think that part of what, particularly for people who are more avoidant in relationships, one of the
Yeah.
things that really gets in the way for them is their perception of the scale of time. They're
Yeah.
like,
Huh.
life is long. Am I
Yeah.
really sure that I want to commit to this person for 40 years? The bar is really, really high. So I think that there are different ways that we can approach thinking about a relationship that can lower that bar a little bit in a healthy way that could help a person frame things in a way where they can really get their mind around it and can really get their mind around showing up really completely inside of the relationship as the best version of of themselves.
I'll tell you, for me, bottom lines would be, of my key needs, can I get them met enough by this person?
Yeah,
Even if they're
totally.
not met exactly as much as I'd really like, can they be met enough? And second, is this person capable of repair? And to me, there really needs to be a big yes to each one of those questions.
Yeah. No, I think that that's great. Okay, I think that was a good job with that question. So let's
Great.
move along to the second one here. I'm in a relationship with somebody who has a long term drug addiction. They function really well on the surface, they go to work, make money, and seem pretty normal day to day. Is it possible to have a truly healthy and functional relationship with this person, just trying to ignore that other fact? I keep going back and forth because nobody is perfect, right? I feel like I want to end things, but I'm also scared of hurting them and scared that maybe I'm walking away from an otherwise great person over something that might not be that big of a deal. Now, very unfortunately, there is not a lot of detail in this question about what they mean by a long term drug addiction. And I think that that's a pretty salient detail in terms of what this person ultimately decides to do. But how are you thinking about this one, Dad?
Well, just like you said, I've known people who are just horrified to discover that somebody drinks alcohol every day. Now,
Sure. Or like
in
smokes
some,
a bowl once a week or something. Yeah.
yeah, in some cultures, yeah, a glass of wine or a beer or two, it's daily, it's not a big deal. On the other hand, let's be really clear, alcohol has very significant health effects,
Yeah.
even if it doesn't have interpersonal consequences, which interestingly have been left out in this question. They don't
Hmm.
refer to any interpersonal consequences. So if you're with someone who doesn't feel like they're all there because they're in a marijuana haze, they're just 1 or 2 steps removed from you, or they're kind of sloppy, or their cognition is fuzzy because, they've had 4 beers, not just two, let's
They
say.
have more emotional volatility because of that, all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or they're, you bring them, you bring them out to show your friends, and after they leave, your friends kind of look at you with their eyebrows raised, like, whoa, your partner was buzzed the whole time. Is that okay? Then that's another thing, of course. So that part. And then there's a question of, is this person responsive to your desires? Like, are your desires, key question, based on the symbolism or the formality of what they're doing, or the concept of it, or because it directly affects you? Does it directly affect you? Now, if it directly affects you, then okay, you really have something to think about here. But if it's more symbolic, like it just bothers you that they like to have a couple beers every night, maybe that's something to look at inside yourself.
For me, big organizing questions. Are they only great when they're sober? Alternatively, hey, does their behavior actually get kind of like more enjoyable for you to be around for whatever reason when they're using, but when they're sober, there are all of these things that are coming out that they're using the substance to cope with.
That's great.
Also, do they use
yeah.
around you or do they not use around you? How does it feel to be around them when they're using?
Yeah.
If we interpret this question through the lens of what I would think of as being like a significant drug issue, which is probably a little bit more than what we've framed so far. We're not just in the world of like having a beer a night or smoking a bowl every once in a while. We're in like a really persistent issue. There's a big difference between that and going to the bathroom to do some cocaine every 15 minutes when you guys go out together. This is going to become a feature of your life. It is very difficult for me to imagine a version of this where this does not become a running conversation that you are bumping your head into every week, certainly, if not most days. And I think that people have to ask themselves a big question, like, do I want this to be a big feature of my life? Do I want this to be something that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about? And if the answer is no, and they're still a great person, well, then I go back to kind of the first question, Dad, the points that you made there. How high do you want to aim here? Where are you in your life? Like, how do you perceive your prospects, frankly, as a potential romantic partner for somebody else? Like, I think that this question changes if you're 22 versus if you're 55 in a lot of different complicated ways. When you're 22, you've got a lot more runway to find the person that you want to end up with. But also some of these behaviors could be more based on a certain developmental period. Maybe the person is interested in working on them. Do they perceive this as being an issue is another huge question. Hello, do they think that they're just fine? Or do you guys agree that there's a problem here? Have you talked about it? I think there are a million follow-up questions before we could get to any kind of a definitive like yes, no answer with this one.
3 quick complications on the way out the door. Children are not mentioned. When kids are involved, that becomes a real thing. Second, is there a shared spiritual practice? So, for example, if you're wanting a partner who can really go into the deepest waters of the pool with you, you do not want their mind, as is put in the 5th precept in Buddhism, clouded and prone to heedlessness, if that's a shared practice. That's not mentioned here. I'm just complicating it. The other complicator is your perception of the other person as someone who needs this to manage their stresses. And is there something going on that this person has turned to this crutch or support to deal with their psychology? And what does that say about them? So that's something to take into account too.
Totally. I think that last one in particular is a big one. Is this a coping mechanism? And if they're coping, what are they coping related to? Is that going to become some kind of a major issue inside of the relationship?
Yeah. So, and why are they taking this out instead of working in other ways with their own mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think that that's good with that question, and we can move on to the third one here, which I found really interesting. I watched your recent video on narcissism, and it really hit home. I recognized myself in almost every trait you described. I give my partner the silent treatment when I'm upset. I can't handle my anger when things don't go my way, and so on. This is particularly the case once I get comfortable in the relationship. I've been in therapy for years for this exact reason, and I can't seem to really change this. Do you have any advice for actually breaking these patterns? It's been my top goal for as long as I can remember, and I can't figure out how to not be this way.
As a therapist, it's a little bit like, forgive the analogy, being a police detective. you're listening for or looking for something that really stands out. So here, the sentence that pops out for me is, this is particularly the case once I get comfortable in the relationship. And that implies to me some possibilities. One possibility is that it's when the person starts to feel really at ease in a relationship and their very young emotional needs are now being met in an intimate relationship that in some ways is like, early relationships in childhood. That's when the sensitivity to empathic breaches really comes forward. And also when the demandingness comes forward as well. So my prescription for this person would be a lot around internalization of healthy narcissistic supplies today. This person does not sound like they have a classic DSM-5 narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah.
There's so much insight here. And, and it's not, there's not the sense that they regard other people as simply an extension of their own being with no
There's a lot
existence.
of interest in the experience of the other person here, which is quite uncommon for people with more of an
Exactly.
NPD
They're not,
diagnosis.
this person's not describing others as an it.
Yeah.
He is describing them as failed thous. In effect, when they get upset. So to me, the opportunity here is to actually internalize healthy narcissistic supplies and do your job. Hello, Mr. Narcissistically Vulnerable or Ms. Narcissistically Vulnerable person. I relate to you. Do your job of taking in what's being offered to you. And meanwhile, try to regulate yourself, better along the way.
So when you say taking in what's being offered to you,
yeah,
what do you mean by that, Dad? Because I think that, again, you're focusing on the once I get comfortable, which implies a sort of depth of emotional intimacy inside of the relationship.
It's so interesting. And also it implies a lot of capacity for top-down self-regulation. They're regulating themselves as long as they kind of feel on the bubble with another person. But as they so-called get comfortable, then they relax that carefulness and self-management. Well, it implies that they have the capacity for self-regulation in the first place, which is fantastic. So as they get more comfortable and the other person in a friendship or maybe a romantic relationship or a working relationship is the kind of the big five, includes them, appreciates them, sees them, likes them, loves them. Any one of those five. Those are the big five and opportunities. So when the fact is that you are with people who actually include you, see you, appreciate you, like you, or love you, let that fact become an experience, which then you slow down to take in the good of. That's what I mean by internalization. And I mean doing it as your inner work, one breath at a time, a dozen times a day. You do that, you take Coach Rick's prescription here, you will feel different at the end of the first day. Hey, only do it half a dozen times a day. You'll still feel different because you're looking for those opportunities, and you'll feel really different after a few days. And the other people will notice that you're different within a week or two.
Yeah. And the complicated piece of this for me is that the kinds of strategies that this person is describing, which are about withdrawal and control on the one hand, that's the silent treatment, and then kind of overreaction and explosion on the other hand, like really blown up at the person. These are typically patterns that we drop into behaviorally when we feel like we can't be emotionally open with other people, or when we feel like we can't let ourselves feel what is really being offered by the other person, or make a vulnerable expression or a vulnerable request. We can't do that. It's not safe to do that. So we have to do something else. We have to figure something else out. And so a question here for this person is, what have you actually tried to this point? Has the therapy that you've done been pretty consistent in terms of its nature? Have you tried different kinds of things and therefore had some things that worked a little better and some things that didn't work? My theory is that there's a chance that this person is really focused, once again, kind of like we were talking about in the first question, on developing insight, which is a place where it's really, really easy for therapy to get kind of stuck.
Yep.
Is the person walks in the room They talk about their internal process a lot. The clinician says, wow, you're so great. You've got such a good internal process. Here's some more stuff that I've been thinking about your internal process. And the person goes like, wow, that's really insightful. I really go and think about that. But nothing happens in between the sessions. There's no actual behavior change. And behavior change is built kind of in 4 steps, as near as I can tell. And I'm curious what your take is on this, Dad. First, some kind of self-awareness. So that's insight. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? Okay, but that's just the first step. We've got a second step, which is making a plan. Now that I know my pattern, how do I want to change it? What does this really look like in the moment, right? So I'm defaulting to a behavior, which is shutting down, giving them the silent treatment or blowing up emotionally. What's the alternative? What are other things I could be doing that I feel like I can do? What are the other things I could be doing? And it's helpful to be very specific about this if you can. The third step, stuff happens in life. Live fire. We get into the interaction, the moment comes, you're in the moment of activation, and that's where change happens one way or the other. Like that's the critical moment. And afterwards, reflection. What happened? Was I able to implement my plan? Did everything fall apart when we actually got into it? Oh crap, how can I help it go better in the future? So that's how behavior change actually happens. You have to go through all of those 4 steps, and then you start a new cycle. That reflection is, again, a kind of insight. And then you move into a new plan, and then you move again into a new experience, and so on, and so on, and so on. So if you're not doing that, then there's no reason to believe that your behavior will ever change in the future. You'll just have insight. You'll feel bad about it when you do the bad behavior. You'll engage in some like self-shaming. And then you'll just be like, oh, woe is me, I can't change. And then you'll just do it again in the future because you never actually developed a real plan for how to create a different outcome for the person.
Yeah, durable shifts inside. By the way, Forrest, that 4-step process was like the best summary I think I've ever heard about the change process. The other sentence that really stood out for me was, I've been in therapy for years for this exact reason, and I can't seem to really change it. Yeah, so the person is describing that when they feel narcissistically injured by their partner, they give them the silent treatment and can't handle their anger. So I just want to tap the brakes there and go, wait a second here. Why can't this, or why doesn't this quite well-regulated person who can white-knuckle their way through relationships until they feel comfortable, why can't this person find a way to communicate that they felt hurt or let down, or that there was a breach of empathy or a misattunement?
Yeah, they could wear a mask just fine earlier. Why can't they wear something resembling a mask now? Why can't they just like take something different on? Yeah.
Yeah, in a sense. Yeah, exactly right. Why can't this person say something like, hey, when you looked away from me when we were talking, the funniest thing happened inside. It just really hit me, and a part of me got really angry. And, I know enough to know that you don't hate me. It was a small thing. I'm just sharing with you my experience. I'm not blaming you. I'm taking responsibility for it, and I'm expressing it partly so I can heal it. Now, that would be a very mature, but doable way of talking about feeling hurt and managing your actor. Why can't this person do that?
Totally. A more accessible version of what you're talking about here, Dad, and then I want you to keep going. Something that can be really helpful for people is to essentially have what I call like a red button that you can push inside of the relationship. So you develop a practice with your partner where this is not when things are blowing up. This is some other time where it's like, hey, I know that I have these bad habits when we communicate. I get offended, I blow up emotionally, I get stressed out, whatever it is. I don't want to do that. But I don't really know how to like not do that in the moment yet. And I want to work on that. And that's a long-term goal for me. But just right now, what I think would be helpful would be for me to have some kind of a phrase that I can say to you. Whatever it is, everything from like a safe word to a phrase like, hey, I'm about to fill in the blank, do whatever the thing is they don't want to do.
Nitroglycerin.
Yeah. Can we just take a break? And so this is a button that you can push during an interaction.
Yeah.
And okay, the agreed thing that you've set up beforehand with your partner is we're just going to take 5 to 10 minutes. Now, it's got to just be 5 to 10 minutes. It can't be forever, can't be 5 months. But assuming that you've got kind of good principles about around how you're applying it, that kind of like a basic practice can really help people out.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. Pausing, the pause button.
Yeah.
Maybe
just
5
being
to
able
10
to hit the pause
hours
button.
sometimes.
Sure. Yeah.
Definitely, soon. Yeah. And so here we have this person, and it's a lot of people what's happening that this person is not able to manage their reactions? Sometimes it's because people just don't want to. Okay. Or maybe in their therapy, which they've been in for years and hasn't really produced lasting shifts inside in this area, deep down, sometimes I find that for people to realize that they need to take responsibility as an adult for their own child mind and their own reactions, it forces them to realize that they will never have received what they really longed for and should have received when they were very young. So there's a grief that gets defended against by being inappropriately demanding as an adult as a way of, managing those young parts of themselves. It can become really kind of poignant to realize, wow, I have to give up the possibility of ever having had a happy childhood, and realize that the demandingness and the insistence and the egocentrism of those very young parts of me, understandable as they are, as sweet as they are, will never be given the complete, unqualified, unconditional, infinitely responsive and skillful caregiving that every 3-year-old should receive. It's just not going to happen. I have to give up the hope of that. And I find for some people deep down, there's kind of an insistence inside. I'm still going to get it. I'm still going to get it. So I'm going to throw a tantrum here. I'm going to give them the silent treatment. I'm going to be explosive if I have to be. And that somehow is going to give me what I've always needed. And it's tough to face really that no, you will never have received what you always needed then, right? And in fact, poignantly, the way you're acting today is getting in the way of receiving what you actually can get that would heal that deep wound inside and gradually fill up the hole in your heart.
Yeah, I totally agree with you here, Dad. My orientation in terms of how I think about particularly these kinds of behaviors, which are so about emotional depth and closeness and
Yeah.
that kind of comfortable intimacy, which are really tied to our earlier experiences and what happened to us when we were kids in our early relationships, experiences with other kids, experiences with our parents, that kind of stuff. I would be very curious if this person has done that kind of like emotional developmental depth work in different kinds of ways. Or if again they've just been floating around in the surface level of insight about current behavior.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think that's a good summary of that question. So let's go on to the fourth one then. This is, I think, for you, Dad, because this is a pretty specific question about being a therapist. I have been a listener for about a year, and I've learned a lot from your podcast. I've also listened to other shows and read a bunch of books related to trauma, and this helped me realize that I needed professional help. I'm wondering how much I should let my psychologist know about all the research I've done. I don't want to turn our sessions into an academic discussion or try to control the process, but it also feels a bit disingenuous to not make it clear. How do I bring all of that into the room without having it take over the space?
That's such an interesting question. It has to do with different views of what therapy is about. My own bias is toward respecting clients. And when I'm a client in one capacity or another, or a patient in one capacity or another, I need to feel that the professional on the other side of the table is respectful toward what I know already. And it's not that I'm trying to manage the treatment of my physical health problem by resorting to Dr. Google. On the other hand, it is very possible for people to learn a lot, in this case, about the mind and be, using that information. A lot for me as a therapist, I feel that I am very happy to share, skillfully, in terms of explanations and so forth, adapted to a person. But I'm really happy to share what I know. Right? Know-how about the human mind is universal. There should not be any secret knowledge here. And it's not so arcane as really tracking the deep, deep, deep biochemistry that would lead to a medication prescription recommendation, that kind of is frankly below my level of knowledge. But what we know about the mind, that's available to us all. So I would say that in general, I don't think it's disingenuous. Pardon me, I think it is disingenuous to act like you don't know certain things, and it's useful. if you have a competent treating professional, to let them know what you know already. And then that's a test. If they get all twitchy about it or start playing their PhD card, eh, that's a yellow flag at a minimum that they can't handle what you know and are not able respectfully to, to talk with you, including maybe based on what you know, you're going to raise a reservation. You're going to say, well, I've read the research literature, and frankly, it shows that cognitive treatments alone tend to be not as effective as cognitive treatments, that include or a somatic element and a behavioral element. What do you think about that, Doc? They got to be able to respond. And if they can't, that's kind of a yellow flag about maybe looking for a different therapist.
Yeah, my basic take on this is that if you have the insight to understand that this is a question and a potential issue, you're probably fine. Just the fact that you're concerned about, am I going to take up too much space with my, cognitive bypassing or whatever around this kind of an issue because I've read 17 books on it or whatever it is, then I think that you're already doing pretty okay. And you probably don't have too much to worry about here. More generally, the thing that I would look out for is this an avoidance tactic?
Yeah.
Is this a kind of cognitive bypassing or a just kind of other I'm gonna sort of get in the way of the clinician doing what they feel like they need to do because I feel uncomfortable about it.
As you can tell, I'm a get to it kind of person. I feel like they're in my room. It's a sacred space. They're investing their time. There's a tremendous opportunity.
Totally.
It's costs money very often for someone to be with a therapist. Hey, we ought to be getting to it. Now, part of effectively getting to it is creating a lot of room for the other person and letting them ramble for a while, and not being too directive as a therapist, but it's in the service of really getting to it. And I think, honestly, if you are Carl Rogers, in your demeanor and your energy and your state of being, you just kind of are, maybe an incredibly non-directive form of counseling is really going to work. But even if you look at Carl Rogers, and you can't help but mirror back selectively certain key things, right? So maybe if you're that kind of person, you can be productive with therapies and you can induct the client into really getting to it, as it were. But unless you're Carl Rogers, maybe there's a place for being much more direct with people about getting to the bottom line and getting to that lasting shift inside. That's the gold standard. That's what we're really after. Those lasting shifts inside that you've talked about. And we need to get to, are they actually happening? And we need to get to what would help them happen if they're not actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very different lens for it, coaching work as opposed to therapy. But my real experience is that sometimes people even come into a coaching context, which is by its nature highly directive, much more directive as a format than therapy is typically.
Usually, yeah.
That being said, I've had people come in and they were not comfortable with the level of direction. That they were not comfortable with me investigating. Okay, so like, what are we doing about this?
Yeah.
How are we going to make this behavior, whatever it is that you're here for, better tomorrow than it was yesterday? And so I think it's really good to pay attention to answer in yourself. Like, are you avoiding that kind of internal confrontation with like, am I getting better around this or not?
I will say, as on the other hand, that one of the clients that I most learned from was someone who, by his own report, kept coming weekly, enjoyed speaking with me, was authentic and open, and by his own report, was getting nothing out of it. He said, yeah, it's just fantastic when I'm with you, Rick. And, it's gone by the time I hit the bottom of the stairs going out of your office. And I don't engage this stuff or think about it whatsoever till I start walking up those stairs the following week, And what was interesting was that when I actually gave up my investment in him getting better, that's when he started getting better.
Yeah, and so much of this is about like who you are and what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? And it kind of, there's a sort of counterintuitive process with it. I mean, if we had Elizabeth in here, she would probably say, look, given the kind of work that I do, I can't have that kind of directiveness. I can't be so like such a blunt instrument outside of the counseling room. We're there for 18 months before we get to like the first distinct piece of advice, because that's the kind of work that I need to do with people.
Yeah.
But so, just there's different strokes for different folks here to some extent. But I do think that that's something to pay attention to if you're seeking therapy.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay. So on to the next one here. I've realized that I'm deeply afraid of not making sense or not being properly understood by other people. This has made me pretty uptight about being logical and evidenced, and I tend to really monitor my behavior along the same lines. But sometimes you want to open yourself up to an experience or act in a way that you can't logically justify. If I were to open up in that way and haven't done so before, how could I do it in a way that would make sense? What do you think about this, Dad?
I'm curious as an opener, and it's so great to do these mailbag things because we don't know. And it's a bit of a Rorschach ink blot, or what's called the thematic apperception test. Actually, I think I may have done it with you, where you just see a picture. It's an ambiguous picture.
I think I was like 14 or something. Yes, I do.
Yeah, and you invite a person to tell a story. And I did that not to psychoanalyze you, but just because I thought it was kind of fun and interesting. Totally. Yeah. Anyway, so these vignettes are like that for us in a way. So I find myself wondering, first of all, what are the environments that this person is in? Is this person in a very technical environment that's a lot about being understood? I also, frankly, wonder about temperamental variation. Some people present themselves interpersonally with a very strong focus on verbal behaviors. Then I would wonder, what's the history here that has led this person to be, deeply afraid of not making sense? That's a funny phrase. Have they had a psychotic break? Have they had times where they just couldn't make sense? Did they grow up in environments where they were really intensely criticized for not being verbally perfect, every moment at the dinner table when they were 9 years old? So I would just start there. Maybe I'll pause and hear if you have some comments. But those are my curiosities.
My experience is that the pain or the fear of being misunderstood is actually a really common one for people. Is that they hate it. This particular type of person just hates it when they feel like people don't get something about them. And I empathize with that, at least to some extent, because I've definitely worn those shoes. Like, I have had a lot of experiences in my life where I felt like I was kind of fundamentally misunderstood by other people. My general take here is that this is a bit of a middle path question, where if you have a tendency to really focus on being hyper logical and hyper rational, which is the part of this that I'm going to pay the most attention to, then it actually is rational, kind of counterintuitively, for you to pay less attention to being rational, because you are using a computer to appraise your behavior that is not accurately calibrated. You have an uncalibrated computer in between your ears. It doesn't quite perceive reality accurately. And because of that, you are acting in a way that doesn't actually make logical sense, even if you have a big focus on being logical about it. And this is something that we kind of see over and over again with people, that when we start tacking against our tendencies, kind of like you were talking about with that client ad, it's when you were able to tack against the desire to bring big transformation to their life that actually change started happening for them. For me, when I was able to loosen up a little bit and kind of lighten up about things, a lot of change started happening for me. We need to be aware of our tendencies so we can actually act in a way that's closer to reality. And I think that sometimes the people who struggle with that the most are the people like this person who have that like really strong logical orientation, because it doesn't really make sense internally for them to do that. Are you kind of following what I'm saying here, Dad? It's a little bit of a difficult one to kind of wrap your hands around.
Yeah. As I dive further into it, one thing that also comes right through the words for me is a wistful longing.
Yeah, totally.
For joining and to be received. I love this phrase from Dan Siegel, to feel felt. And so we have two elements here. We have cognitive understanding, which this person is emphasizing, and curiously is also emphasizing with regard to the second thing that they're longing for, which is empathy. And it's as if they're thinking, well, if I could just say what I'm saying like Spock in a better way, suddenly then that will increase the empathic attunement for others. But that's not necessarily true, right? So also, I'm just so struck by someone who's deeply afraid of not making sense. That's an unusual, deep fear. Uh, what makes you think that you don't make sense? Or are there things bubbling around inside you that maybe are alarming to you because they're uh, very irrational? If you are being authentic, authenticity promotes empathy in others. Logical explanations that explain your psychology usually confuse other people.
Yeah,
They
for
actually
sure.
disrupt
100%.
empathy.
Yeah.
So if you
I
want to
totally
be,
think your truffle pig nose is right here, Dad. That I think that there's a chance that this person's behavior is actually getting in the way of what they want.
yeah, that's right. Truffle pig nose. I like that. I like that. That's great. Yeah. So then I would say to this person, it's interesting. What are the experiences you have in which you are adequately empathized with? Maybe they don't get everything, but at least they get something. And are you internalizing that experience? Going back to your 4-step model of making a plan, acting, and then reflecting on the results. And that reflection would include internalization of positive results to reinforce the skill or behavior you're trying to encourage in yourself. So when you do communicate in such a way that you do receive the empathy you long for, and you're very afraid of not getting, but when you do receive it, take it in, which will also calm down some of the anxieties inside, and it will give you an opportunity to improve your skills in how you communicate to promote the kind of empathy you want in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great point here, Dad, and really is maybe the crux of the question in terms of what is the real objective that this person is seeking out? Like, what do they actually want to get with other people? In other words, what's the problem that they're trying to solve by being so logical and rational and process driven?
Yeah.
And could they solve that problem more effectively by stepping into a different way of acting?
Yeah. And meanwhile, honor your longing for this. And maybe I'm going to be a little curmudgeonly here, but the truth is, in my view, most people are poor listeners statistically in my sample of life. They're just not great at sustaining attention, actually hearing the words, and being prepared to be empathic. Right? They're just not. So part of life is, how do we deal with that fact? How do we deal realistically with the fact that many people are not good listeners? And how do we influence people effectively to be the listeners that we need them to be, and take that into account? So that's part of the thing here, honoring your own longing for good listening, good empathy, and being realistic about what's possible, and then influencing other people to be able to give you what you need from them.
Great. So we have one last question for this mailbag. And again, I think this one is mostly for you, Dad. I might chime in a little bit. I'd like some advice on how to work on my meditation practice in a way that is safe for me. I'm drawn to spiritual practices, but I also have a family history of psychosis that I'm afraid of triggering. Additionally, my past meditation practice has led me into depersonalization and depression. I want to reap the benefits of meditation, but I also want to do it in a safe way. Do you have any thoughts on how to walk that line?
Yeah, there's been a lot of work on this, really led initially by Dr. Willoughby Britton of Brown University, and people can look up Dr. Britton's work. It's just great. And related concerns about what are sometimes called spiritual emergencies that tend to happen most often for relatively vulnerable people, such as a person with a family history of psychosis or a previous, let's say, manic episode, in particularly intensive settings like a silent 10-day retreat. And yes, it is also the case that sometimes people who are doing kind of more casual meditation for maybe 20 minutes in their living room can suddenly have something bubble up that is particularly problematic for them. That is true, but it's typically more vulnerable people in more intensive settings. It's also the case that, as David Treleaven has done a great deal of work with, if someone has a trauma history which is not referred to here, I'm just bringing it in, that too is something that can bubble forward and really invade someone and hijack them on an intensive meditation retreat. So it's worth being careful in these regards and not, underestimating those risks. That said, it is sometimes, the New York Times loves debunking anything it possibly can. So it is sometimes the case that people will take those fairly small percentage of the population risks and then generalize that to, tons of alarm about basic mindfulness practices or meditative practices that are, perfectly safe for most people contextually. So then the question becomes, all right, if you do have those risks, how can you deepen your practice without, falling off the trail? One thing is to use meditation objects that are particularly reassuring and centering, like tuning into the area around the heart and resting in a sense of your own goodness, your own caringness, your own warm-heartedness, maybe receiving the caring of other people, potentially using that as an object of meditation. Another one would be to use forms of moving practice, like being meditative while doing Pilates or while doing yoga or while walking, including walking very slowly, potentially. So those acts of movement tend to keep organizing people and disrupt any tendencies toward depersonalization or fragmentation or depressed mood or any kind of an eruption from down below.
So just to add a layer into what you're saying here, Dad, depersonalization, if people are not familiar with the word, is a feeling of detachment from yourself, essentially. It's like it's an out-of-body experience, but not in a good way. It's in a extreme form of dissociation, could be maybe a way to refer to it. And all of the things that you're talking about, which are body-driven and somatically oriented, are essentially the opposite of depersonalization, right? So we're trying to add a layer of like active engagement with the flesh, maybe to put it a certain kind of way, in order to counter this person's tendency a little bit. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Maybe a couple other things. When a person speaks of the benefits of meditation, it depends on what you're interested in. One of the major benefits is training attention. So if that's one of the benefits for you, you could do some simple meditative practices that are like counting practices where you pick an object like the breath or a phrase, and you deliberately train your attention to rest in that particular object. Something that I've been doing recently that's had startling benefits for me is I've brought to mind someone who's no longer alive, and I just rest in appreciation of them for 5 minutes in a row during my meditation practice. My mind might wander a bit, but I come back to that appreciation of them. It's an interesting object of meditation, but that is something potentially to focus on. So that would be an example. Also, insight. People often meditate in part to deepen their insight into the nature of experiences as transient and made of parts that occur dependently upon their causes. Therefore, our experiences are streaming along, but they're more like passing clouds than permanent bricks. And that's a kind of an insight. Well, that's a pretty good insight. If you can do it, hopefully it will not lead to depersonalization. You're still here. Your personness, you are still personing along, but you are personing along like a streaming, river, not like a frozen block of ice.
Great. I don't know if I have enough experience and knowledge here to really add too much to what you've already said here, Dad. I thought that was a great answer. My general understanding is that, yes, there are people for whom this is an issue. And if you are one of those people, be really careful about it. It is more important that you not have a psychotic break than it is that you meditate daily. Like, it's just more important to avoid that downside risk than it is for you to build some kind of a meditation practice, given that there are many, many, many ways into probably the kinds of benefits that this person is looking for that do not necessarily involve like insight meditation or something like that, which can be pretty intense if you do it in certain kinds of ways. That being said, this tendency is extremely uncommon, and most people can meditate totally safely, totally fine for long periods of time. It's all okay.
Yeah, and I'm somehow drawn just to finish on this one thing, which is there are different kinds of meditation. And, I'm mostly trained in the meditative tradition of early Buddhism and its expressions through the now called Theravada uh, branch of Buddhist practice. And that branch actually has a lot of emphasis on cultivation, not bear witnessing. And bear witnessing is okay. Open awareness practices are okay. But they do tend to lead potentially to a certain spaciness and a certain dissociation, unless you're really quite grounded. Alternately, there can be practices of focused attention or absorption in which you are helping yourself gently. You are kind of evoking or coming home to certain fundamental qualities of being and highlighting them. And intuitively, I'm drawn to underline that for this particular person and also for many, many people to think of meditation as homecoming, as returning to a kind of equilibrium condition in the body mind where there's a deep coming to rest in a felt sense of being safe enough, satisfied enough, and connected enough in the present, needs met enough in the present. So there's a calming, there's a settling, and there's an establishing of sustained presence with various experiences like sounds and sights and thoughts passing through awareness as you yourself are increasingly settled in a really wholesome way. That is a good meditation. And neurologically, of course, you are reinforcing that in your brain. You are establishing that way of being increasingly as a trait based on repeatedly internalizing states of it that are, elicited and evoked when you're meditating. And you're a lot less likely, I think, to, have a psychotic eruption if you're doing that kind of practice that I've described.
Yeah. Great points here, Dad. I really enjoyed doing this mailbag with you today. I thought this
Same,
was a really fun
always.
one. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Bring the mail. It's really great.
Deliver every day, including Mondays, which is where we end the podcast.
That's good.
It's always great to talk with Rick, and it's always great to answer some questions from our listeners. If you have a question that you would like to have answered on the podcast, you can reach us at contact@beingwellpodcast.com. You can also find us on Patreon, patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And for just a couple of dollars a month, you can get access to bonuses like transcripts of the episodes and ad-free versions of them as well. Also, quick reminder about Rick's self-worth workshop. It's an online course. It starts on October 4th, and you can learn more about it at rickhanson.com/worthy and use coupon code beingwell25 to receive a 25% off discount. It's always a little bit tricky to recap the mailbag episodes because we talk about a lot of different things. So I try to find little themes that can be like notes to myself, both as I'm doing the recording and in terms of what do I want to take from all of this, right? Like, what do I want to learn based on what we talked about today? And what really stood out to me was this running theme where often in life, a lot of different choices can be a reasonable, rational choice. Do you get back with that person who you broke up with once? Do you choose to get into a relationship with somebody who has some kind of meaningful underlying issue? What do you want to do about this situation where your behavior tends to loop over and over again, right? And you're just having a hard time getting past this issue. A lot of rational answers to that question. You could go with them, you could not. Both answers could be legitimate. The question is, did you engage in good process? That's what we kept on coming back to today. What was the process? What steps did you go through? What questions did you ask in a rational, thorough, and often for people quite spooky and uncomfortable way to get the information that you needed to make a good decision? So first question was about whether or not somebody should get back with a person who they had had this kind of anxious and avoidance cycle with, right? Where that person was more distancing and they were more anxiously approaching them. And there was this underlying question of commitment. Does this person actually want to be in a relationship with me? Rick started by essentially mentioning that life is long, so aim for the high end if you can. You're probably going to be with this person for a while if it works out. You really want to get your needs met. And then he also had a clarification toward the end of his answer about what does he mean by get your needs met? One person is probably not going to meet all of our needs in all of the domains all of the time. That's an unrealistic expectation. But we can hope that this person will be pretty good most of the time. And particularly, our attachment needs are some of the most fundamental that we have. We really want to be with somebody who does not constantly make us question whether or not they want to stick around. So if that's a running issue inside of the relationship and you feel like it hasn't really been addressed, it's going to keep on being a big problem. And this related to some of my thoughts about it, which can be summarized by asking, is there just insight here, or have we actually gotten into behavior change? It sounds like both the people have really learned about themselves through this process. They figured out more about what they like, what they don't like. But hey, what you going to do about it? Is this person actually going to be different in the future? And have you established clarity between the two of you that they really want to be committed to you in the way that you want as well? Second, there was a question from somebody about getting into a relationship with a person who had a long-term drug addiction. Rick started by clarifying, what do we mean by drug addiction here? There are a lot of different standards around consumption of different substances in different cultures or for different people. What I might consider a drug addiction could be very different from what another person would consider a drug addiction. And without really knowing the severity of the issue, it's kind of hard to give advice here. But we did have a couple of pointers here. First, Rick had a point about whether or not the substance addiction was a way for the person to avoid other kinds of issues or psychological problems that they have. Are they using this to defend against something where even if they abandon the substance, all of these other issues might emerge inside of the relationship? For me, what I really come back to with this is, yes, nobody's perfect. Everybody's got issues. The question is, are you comfortable having your partner's issues be a big part of your life? Are you comfortable with that family of issues? And substance addiction in general is one of those issues that it's really difficult for it to not rear its head on a day-to-day basis for this person, either because they enter treatment for it, and that becomes a lifelong process most of the time for people, or because they never really address the issue and then they're using the substance all the time, and you have to ask yourself, is that something that you're really comfortable with? The third question was extremely interesting. It was about somebody who perceived themselves as being narcissistic and said that they had been trying to work on these narcissistic issues, which included giving their partner the silent treatment or really blowing up at them and being emotionally dysregulated. But they'd had a very difficult time making meaningful progress. We started by saying that based on how this person was talking, it seemed kind of unlikely to both of us. I'm not a clinician, but just based on my conversations with people about narcissism, it seemed kind of unlikely that this person would qualify for a diagnosis of NPD. There was a lot of insight. There seemed to be a lot of interest in how the other person was experiencing the world. It did not really seem like this person was using other people as a way to fulfill a kind of need for themselves. And just in general, the tone of the question was not what I would expect coming from somebody with NPD. Then I want to make kind of a broad point here. For somebody who has what I would call a subclinical version of an issue, so this is not something where they need to enter treatment, be medicated, that kind of a thing. The problem is not the label that they have. The problem is the pattern of behavior, right? So for this person, the problem is not whether or not they self-identify as a narcissist or whether people refer to them as narcissistic or whatever else. That's not really the issue. The issue is that they're doing stuff that is having a consequence for them and for the people around them, and they want to stop that behavior. So we have a very fundamental behavioral issue here. This person is having a hard time regulating their emotions, particularly when they feel emotionally vulnerable with somebody else. I then outlined a process that a person can go through with pretty much any behavioral issue. First, you have to start with insight, and that's clearly what this person has. They've got really good insight. But have they moved from that insight to actually doing something about the problem, right? And that's where the second step comes in. That's planning. Now that the person knows their pattern, how do they want to change it? What does that actually look like for them in practice, right? Then third, we have whatever happens in the moment. This is the live fire demo. This is life rearing its ugly head, right? You get into a moment with your partner where you would get activated. Do you? Are you able to apply your plan? Do things go well? Do they go poorly? What happens? And then the fourth step is reflection. Now what? We saw what happened. What new plan do we want to create for the future? And this then allows us to access another level of insight. And then the process starts over again. Rick was very interested in the fact that this person's behavior got worse the more comfortable that they got in the relationship. And if that's happening, then there's probably something in the mix about emotional vulnerability. Has this person been able to internalize the healthy version of narcissistic supplies and really take that in, really ground down into the relationship in a way where they can understand I'm safe, I'm comfortable, I can be authentic with my partner. I can say, hey, I didn't like that you did that thing. And then you don't have to give them the silent treatment anymore. You can actually be more emotionally exposed. And what's the 1% version of that? What is the version where you don't go to total emotional closeness and you aren't like deeply revealed in that moment necessarily, but you're able to say, hey, I'm about to wander into some of that bad behavior. I don't want to do it. So I need to take kind of a pause for 5 or 10 minutes here. The next question was about how much psychoeducation to bring into the room when you start seeing a new therapist. And both Rick and I agreed as much of it as you want to, essentially. The only thing that you have to really be aware of here is, are you doing it as a form of cognitive bypassing? Or are you doing it as a way to add color about yourself and ask meaningful questions of your therapist? Fifth question was about somebody who had a fear of not making sense and therefore became very logical and kind of hyper-rational in how they talked. This question kind of has two pieces to it. The first is a fear of being misunderstood, which is very common in people. And the second is this hyper-monitoring of their own behavior. And this took me to a general point. When we are really far toward one end of the spectrum, if we think about there being a scale from -10 to +10, if we're a +10, it makes sense for us to tack a little bit toward the middle. If we're a -10, it makes sense for us to move toward a +10. So the advice that we give this person is not going to be the same as the advice that we give somebody who is hyper not rational. The takeaway is that most of the time, healthy behavior is flexible and fairly moderate in nature. You are neither hyper anxious nor totally unaware of what's going on around you. You aren't hyper rational and you aren't hyper irrational. You can see all the tools, you can play with all the toys. Now, this can be actually particularly difficult for people who are hyper logical and rational, who are very top down and cognitive. And I say this as somebody who has walked in those shoes and has a lot of experience with that personally. Because what do you mean I'm being too logical? That's not a real thing. There's no such thing as too logical and too rational. The problem here is it depends on what we mean by too logical and too rational. It might not feel logical to go out with your friends the weekend before you have a big exam, but it could still be a good decision if you put up the right guardrails. If you say, hey, I'm gonna get home by this time, and hey, I'm not gonna drink anything or not gonna drink too much. I'm gonna be thoughtful about my behavior because I'm serving a different goal. And this actually reveals a basic principle in logic, which is that what is logical, what is rational, is predicated on our values and our assumptions. This means that there is not some kind of absolute obvious truth out there in terms of most questions, because the answers are built on the things that we care about. And the irony in this question is that that kind of hyper-rationality seems to be getting in the way for this person of what they actually want, which is to feel felt and be understood by others. That's empathy. That's emotional relationship. And when you are the person who is doing a cosplay of Spock in your interactions with other people, it's very difficult for them to kind of go to that emotional relational place with you. So in a funny way, the coping behavior, what this person is doing in order to solve the problem of feeling misunderstood, is actually making them more likely to feel misunderstood. Our final question was from somebody who was concerned that their meditation practice would lead them into an episode of depersonalization or depression, which they had experienced in the past. And Rick gave some good advice about this. The quick one-sentence summary is that if you are concerned about dissociation in general, particularly based on a meditation practice, a great way to approach it is by doing aspects of the practice that bring you into a more direct relationship with your body. Long story short, there are a lot of ways to meditate. And yes, insight meditation is a particular form of meditation that could lead to these kinds of depersonalization experiences that sometimes happen for people. That's a pretty intense form of meditation, and there are a lot of other options out there for people. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you've made it this far and you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the podcast when you can. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment. If you're listening on Spotify, you can also leave a comment on the episodes. Hey, if you're watching on Apple, you can leave a rating and a positive review. That really helps us out. And again, you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.